Really pleased to welcome our speaker today, Carissa Chew, based at the University of Hawaii. Carissa undertook a 9-month Equalities, Diversity and Inclusion internship at the National Library of Scotland before completing 2 inclusive cataloguing projects with the Imperial War Museum and Glasgow School of Art. And she's going to discuss some of that work today and how it is progressing. So I will pass you over to Carissa, and thank you all very much again.
Great, thank you everyone for coming, and thanks for the introduction. I'm Carissa Chew, and to introduce myself and repeat some of that information as well. So I'm a history PhD student and teaching assistant at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. So I am in Honolulu at the moment, and it's 11:30 p.m. for me. So I apologize that my lighting is pretty bad in this room. My main research focus is mixed race history in 20th century East Africa, but I have been engaged in equalities work in the heritage sector for 2 years now. In 2020, I did my 9-month EDI internship with the National Library of Scotland, and then last summer I worked on 2 separate and quite different inclusive cataloguing projects with the Glasgow School of Art Library and the Imperial War Museums. I've done talks for a number of organisations, and I've been developing further resources for the sector in my own time. So 3 things that I've created that I'm going to share today are the Inclusive Terminology Glossary, my 10 principles for inclusive description work, and the Cultural Heritage Terminology Network. And my aim today is to give a broad overview of some of these strands of work that I've been doing, with a focus on practical actions and steps that can be taken to decolonize the language that is used in the heritage sector. And there should be plenty of time for questions afterwards, if there's anything in particular about my work that you'd like to know more about. So just before I start, I'd like to give a content warning that I will be referring to and sharing resources that do contain examples of discriminatory language and harmful imagery. So my work is based on the rationale that the heritage sector can use language as a tool to create and curate socially conscious catalogues, collections, displays, and learning resources for the future. There is power in textual representation, and when a text paints a derogatory and dehumanizing image of an entire group of people, it can serve to legitimize hatred toward them. Language choices can enact forms of non-physical violence, such as psychological, bureaucratic, and symbolic violence. And words can, of course, also encourage and provide legitimation for hate crimes and physical acts of violence. Consciously or not, description, displays, and subject headings written and used by heritage professionals often reproduce colonial discourses of power. And when heritage institutions replicate racist, sexist, homophobic, or ableist fantasies today, they not only contribute to the circulation of misinformation, but they perpetuate the violence of misrepresentation. When we apply essentialized ahistorical categories and labels to entire groups of people, we risk the creation of distorted information and the reproduction of harmful stereotypes. And when our language is homogenizing, we cause additional harm by erasing diversity and dishonoring people's self-identities. To quote Colleen McGloin and Bronwyn L. Carlson in their study on the politics of language, written text has the capacity to construct reality, produce ideas, beliefs, and stereotypical representations, represent, misrepresent, and imbue readers and viewers with particular views about the world. The decolonization of language is therefore incredibly important. And if we think about this just from a practical perspective, using the most appropriate terminology available is in the heritage sector's best interest, because it enhances the quality of collections information and improves the discoverability of materials, complementing the accurate curation of the historical record. So in terms of practical actions, it can be incredibly useful to start by outlining the sector's key goals when it comes to descriptive practice. This top-down policy-driven approach is one that the National Library of Scotland decided to explore, and I was hired in 2020 to help them draft a descriptive practices policy. For reasons unknown to myself, the policy is still yet to be published, so I have adapted a more general set of principles that I am able to share today. And these 10 principles for inclusive description work should be relevant for most heritage institutions. So number 1, acquisition or providing access to an item does not imply endorsement of any statements or opinions contained therein. 2, it is the duty of the cultural heritage institutions to accurately maintain the historical record. It is not appropriate for cultural heritage professionals to alter or censor the original historical record, including language contained within collections, published titles, and official names. 3, cultural heritage institutions have a responsibility to meet modern descriptive standards and describe and interpret materials in a manner that is accurate, respectful, and responsive to the communities who create, use, and are represented in their collections. When appropriate, this work will involve the remunerated involvement of the communities in question. Number 4, it is the duty of cultural heritage institutions to improve the quality of educational information for the purpose of enhancing and maintaining the authenticity, integrity, and reliability of records and resources, and to promote the ethical use of information contained within their collections and resources. Number 5, where the original language in collections is harmful or discriminatory, cultural heritage institutions should strive to provide additional historical context and appropriate advisory content. Number 6, description and interpretation should be harnessed as a tool to improve the discoverability of resources relating to underrepresented communities. Number 7, descriptive and interpretive practice should reflect professional values and ethics and contribute to a culture of accountability, trust, and transparency. Number 8, cultural heritage institutions have a responsibility to support their staff with the task of inclusive description work. This includes emotional support as well as professional development and training to ensure staff are equipped to complete inclusive descriptive work judiciously and thoughtfully. Number 9, cultural heritage institutions should share their expertise and use their voices to reform national and international frameworks of agreed standards and vocabularies. And number 10, descriptive and interpretive standards will need to continue to be updated to reflect changes in knowledge, practice, and values in the future. Having this kind of published set of principles is an important way to communicate with users for the sake of transparency and accountability. But to avoid simply paying lip service to the problem, there must also be follow through with meaningful action and the investment of time, money, and resources into all of these efforts. We must therefore be held accountable for the language that we choose to use and the context that we choose to provide, but this can be incredibly difficult in practice when dealing with a full range of protected characteristics and different histories around the world and from different periods of time. So when I was surveying the National Library of Scotland's online resources, I started to make a list of historic terms that had been used to discriminate against groups with protected characteristics in the past. But this list continued to expand as I realized I also needed to educate myself about the preferred terminology of marginalized groups today and how these terminology preferences have changed over time. I found that there were some existing guidelines out there, but these did not relate to all areas of protected characteristics, and these were mostly produced in the USA, Australia, and the Netherlands. And this has left an enormous gap in our knowledge about the language legacies of the British Empire. So to properly survey the National Library of Scotland's online catalogues, I needed not only some understanding of different histories around the world, but also an understanding of the language of race, diaspora, disability, and LGBTQIA+ issues in Britain and its former colonies, as well as specific local and regional terminologies that are used across the UK. So to facilitate the identification of harmful terms and to provide guidance on more appropriate terminology, I created the Inclusive Terminology Glossary, which now exists on Google Drive as a collaborative online project. It is very much a work in progress, and anybody can contribute to it to improve the quality of information that it contains. This live glossary is unique because I created it with cultural heritage professionals in mind, and it's more ambitious in scope than any other project that exists. It includes notes on time periods in which particular terms were used and contains archaic spellings and misspellings to help with the task of identifying discriminatory language and harmful materials across catalogues and collections. The glossary is useful whether you're working to identify harmful records, working on adding advisory notices to your catalogues, or actively making amendments to your metadata. So it shows a list of terms related to different protected characteristics, along with a contextual note on the appropriate use of terminology and any preferred or alternative terms that exist. These linguistic dilemmas are often very complex, and the glossary aims to provide guidance that heritage professionals can use to make better informed decisions when it comes to their language choices. It is an educational tool rather than a quick fix kind of guide. A lot of the terms that come up are not necessarily offensive in their own right, but they can be harmful when misapplied to people or places. For ease of navigation, the glossary is split into numerous sections reflecting different areas of history and protected characteristics. So you can see, for example, there are sections on African American history and the Atlantic slave trade, Native American history, empires and imperialism, disability history, the history of anti-Semitism, Scottish sectarianism, and LGBTQIA+ history. One question that I always get asked is about the future development of the glossary. And there have been conversations with the National Library of Scotland and other UK-based partners about its development into a more sophisticated, dynamic database. But to be honest, these conversations are yet to amount to any real progress. It's been months since we had our last meeting. So I'm keen to continue expanding the Google document as it is and sharing what is already available. This is quite urgent and immediate work, so there's no reason why we can't work with the Google document instead of waiting for this official project to develop. So what I would eventually hope to see is the glossary project to get funding behind it so that we can hire a series of editors and community groups who can periodically review the different sections of the guidance so that there is the remunerated involvement of the communities that are represented in the glossary to make it truly inclusive in its nature. When it comes to actual metadata changes that have been implemented using the glossary as a guide, I've provided some examples on the slide based on my work with the National Library of Scotland's Archives and Manuscripts Catalogue. So, for example, the colonial term Hottentot was supplemented with the preferred ethnic identity Khoikhoi. Lunacy was replaced with mental health. The epithet pro-slavery advocate was added to the catalogue because anti-slavery advocate was being used, but it was not the opposite was not being labelled as what it was. The terms Negroes and chattel slaves were replaced with enslaved Africans, and the incredibly vague term Orientalist, which was applied to a person who studied any elements of South Asian, East Asian, or Middle Eastern civilizations, was replaced with more descriptive and place-specific language, things such as Semitic studies scholars, archaeologists, linguists, diplomats, colonial administrators, etc., to be more specific and help users discover the materials that they are looking for related to the areas of the world that they are looking for. So another important thing that I've worked on, in particular with the Glasgow School of Art Library, was the development of item-level advisory notices in their published catalogue. And advisory notices are a great way to denormalize the usage of harmful materials and promote the ethical use of your collections, whilst giving users the agency to decide how they want to engage with harmful or distressing resources. Often it is original historical and published materials themselves that contain problematic language, which we cannot edit or censor. And in these cases, it is essential to provide appropriate historical context. And I worked with staff at the Glasgow School of Art Library to create guidelines and these kinds of practical flowcharts on how to deal with this issue of adding advisory notices. And this is an example of what these advisory notices look like in the Glasgow School of Art's Primo catalogue. It was really impressive what they were trying to do in terms of adding extra context to already published materials. But this is only one approach that an institution might take when it comes to advisory content and filters. So on the slide, there are examples of some other different approaches that institutions have taken. So you can see these options include institutional harmful language statements, title level warnings, which mean that if you access the record through a search engine like Google, you can't bypass that warning in any way. Image filters, which is something that the V&A do to blur out particular images containing key terms. So you have to kind of double click it that you want to view it, even if it's potentially harmful, and pop up acknowledgements as well, where the user has to tick that they understand the nature of the content on the site. So to move on to the third resource that I want to share today, I think it is incredibly important to promote cross-institutional collaboration when it comes to inclusive description work, because it is an enormous task and it is one that does require urgency. I've been actively trying to share my work as widely as possible because it is of benefit to the whole sector, and this tends to be an underfunded and under-resourced area of work for many institutions. And in a way, lack of access to knowledge and resources has become an excuse for some institutions not to prioritize equalities work. With this in mind, I created the Cultural Heritage Terminology Network as a virtual space that promotes practice sharing and cross-institutional collaboration on all kinds of inclusive description issues. This started as a Slack page and is now on Twitter, but the main thing is going to be the website, which unfortunately is not quite ready to launch. It has a few technical issues, but hopefully within the next couple of weeks it will be live. And you can sign up to the newsletter to receive updates, and we will be putting a link in the chat to that. So when it is ready, it will essentially be a home for everything that you need to know about inclusive description, but also it will have a blog and a discussion forum to encourage conversation and practice sharing. So I'm going to switch my screen and show you a preview of the website, which currently works on desktop, but does not work on mobile. So I need to fix that before I officially launch it. So the homepage looks like this, with some general information about the different things you can access here. There's ways to get involved, kind of things about the creation of the network itself, and blog posts too. So everything that I've been sharing about the Inclusive Terminology Glossary, and if you lose this link, which I know is an awkward Google Drive kind of link, it will be here on culturalheritageterminology.co.uk. So there's another kind of information page on the glossary, and you can access it directly here. The EDI resources is what I am most excited to share. I think this is going to be incredibly useful. There's a lot of different kinds of guidance out there, and a lot of institutions are sharing their own lists. But this is a very comprehensive list of everything that I have encountered during my 2 years of working on this. So there is a selection of featured books at the top, all which are kind of linked through. And then a huge list of different kinds of guidance related to descriptive practice, specifically within the heritage sector. So a lot of work has already been done on this, from different kinds of projects to journal articles, books, and recorded conferences that you can click through and watch. There's then more specific guidance on indexing, classifications, and alternative vocabularies that can be used, which is itself another issue related to inclusive description that I didn't go into much detail about in this talk, but actually looking at subject headings as something that need to be reviewed, and challenging Library of Congress subject headings in particular is a movement in itself. So there's lots of alternatives here. More general language guidance, so not necessarily just within the sector, but other online databases and journalistic guidelines and government guidelines, things like that. There's examples of advisory notices and policy. So I mentioned we see some institutional statements. You can click through these and see all these examples of mostly university libraries in the US and some other heritage organizations that have already published statements on harmful language in their collections. There's catalog level warnings, item level warnings, and these different content filters that I showed you from the BBC archives and the V&A. There's then published codes of ethics, and then specific resources related to restitution and repatriation, which is a slightly separate but not completely unrelated issue. And then different sort of thematic kinds of resources as well. So accessibility, training and professional development opportunities. Some of these are courses where you can hire people to come to your institution and help train your staff in some of these areas. Emotional support resources, which is essential when dealing with some of these kinds of issues. It can be incredibly mentally draining, and there's a lot of emotional labor for certain members of staff who are engaged in doing this. And then there's also examples of other great projects and blogs and even museums and exhibitions related to these different areas of protected characteristics. So decolonization and anti-racism, which is a very long list, gender and sexuality, disability, working class heritage, and sustainability. So this is hopefully going to be an incredibly useful resource for anyone engaging with inclusive description. And it is also open for suggestions as well. So if there's anything that's missing, if there's a new project that somebody is working on, then please send that to me. This only works if it is collaborative and people do engage with this. There's also going to be a forum feature, which is maybe looking a little bit dated, but it does work. So we might just kind of go ahead with the form that it is in. So people can have conversations with each other about particular inclusive description issues, particularly like terminology questions or questions about best practice, or you can share examples from your own institution. So for example, if you have a question about terminology related to gender and sexuality, then you can just kind of post it here and hopefully get a response from other people who are working on this. And there will be a blog as well. So that is the website, which will hopefully be launched very soon. And just to finish up and return to my PowerPoint. So the last thing that I just wanted to comment on is returning to this wider question of decolonization and emphasizing that the review of discriminatory language is just one aspect of a broader effort that needs to take place to dismantle the sector's inherited colonial structures and legacies. Inclusive description work will essentially be superficial unless it is accompanied by a cultural shift in attitudes across the sector and greater representation of people from marginalized backgrounds in the workforce, particularly in higher pay grades and positions of management. From reviewing recruitment policies to increasing the accessibility of building spaces, abolishing unpaid internships, improving job security, offering professional development relating to issues of equality, and creating more effective support systems for employees doing emotional labor, the sector needs to be more accommodating towards people from disadvantaged backgrounds. And as part of this multifaceted project, we need to see institutions acknowledge the provenance of objects that were acquired through colonial aggression or the profits of the transatlantic slave trade, along with the increased restitution and repatriation of stolen cultural artifacts and human remains currently held in the UK. It is only through committing to a culture of transparency and accountability over a prolonged period of time that heritage institutions can hope to regain the trust of their underserved communities. And to remain relevant to contemporary society, institutions will need to build reciprocal relationships with marginalized groups to understand their needs and better serve their interests, which must include compensation for their time and involvement when appropriate. So that is the end of my presentation. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and any questions.
If you want to type questions in, please do, but if you prefer to speak, raise your hand and I will do my best to sort of work out how to switch your microphones on. Thank you very much. That was incredibly stimulating and very interesting, and the resources are incredible, and there's a lot of love for them in the chat box already. Just one really simple practical question out of interest. Given the scale that some people have in the collections, it can be seen as overwhelming on where to get started. And that is, what is a best first step to actually sort of begin to embed this in work within an archive, would you say?
Yeah, so in my experience, I've always started with a survey of the issue, which isn't necessarily documenting everything harmful that is there, but doing a number of keyword searches to begin with to see the kind of things that are coming back and getting to know that kind of search engine in itself as well. Sometimes you'll put in a term, you're going to get hundreds of results, and they're not necessarily things that are using that term in a context that is harmful. So kind of once I had the glossary, and this is what I did with the Imperial War Museums, I surveyed their collections and actually took note of every single instance and made suggested metadata changes, is I just did it in the order of the glossary, which doesn't necessarily reflect anything in particular, but some areas can be seen as more high priority than others. There's been a lot of work on the language related to the slave trade and African American history, and with the Black Lives Matters movement, drawing attention to kind of the special marginalization that Black people have experienced throughout history. That tends to be my starting point, and it is the first number in the glossary. So I do just tend to kind of work through that, not necessarily searching every single term, but the ones that I think are sometimes the most harmful or just the most likely to appear based on the context and based on some knowledge of the collections.
I had a very pertinent question. So yeah, the work is fantastic. It will provide an incredibly useful frame of reference for so many. What are the significant institutional barriers you faced in trying to practically implement this work? And would you make any specific recommendations about how to overcome them?
Yeah, that's a really big question. I'm in a very interesting position because I'm not currently employed in the sector, and I've pretty much been doing freelance work with different institutions. So it has been very different at these different institutions, especially last summer, simultaneously working with the Imperial War Museums and the Glasgow School of Art Library, and they had very different approaches and very different kind of expectations on what was achievable. With the Imperial War Museums, I was giving recommendations, but those recommendations were not necessarily going to be taken on board. They would be taken by who I was working with and then kind of filtered possibly and reframed to management, and then that decision is beyond the scope of my work as an external reviewer of the collections. Whereas with the Glasgow School of Art Library, I found that from my previous experience, I've been told things like, oh, you can't change the published catalogue, we can only work with archival records. It was actually the staff who were pushing me a little bit as well to say like, well, why not? Why don't we write to ex-libris and petition for them to add new features to this catalogue so that we can change it in the future? And that really sort of opened my mind to the possibilities that are available, and being able to recognize some of those institutional barriers where it isn't actually a barrier, but people are unwilling to kind of push against that and just kind of accept something as standard practice and the norm, rather than seeing it as something that we can work in the long term to change. So I don't know if that answers the question specifically. I'm trying to think of more kind of specific barriers that come up, but if you want to follow that up with anything specific, I can try and respond in more detail.
Very specific question is, out of interest, was derogatory language historically used towards Indigenous Gael speakers in Scotland included in the research? I
don't think that topic has been included, but there's a lot of oversight in the glossary. So I was conscious that I wanted to include specific Scottish terms, but I don't actually have a background in Scottish history. So yeah, I think that does need to be developed more because there wasn't kind of existing guidelines on that, and I didn't do like primary research in that area. So yeah, that can be added in.
That's a good call for a volunteer if we can get assistance for that. Oh, good, another question has come in. How do we identify ethnicity in the archives without othering? So
I think it can be very difficult at times when there's not that information available about these source materials. So I often found that when working with the glossary, as I mentioned, it's not necessarily that a term is offensive, but you don't know whether the correct term has been applied to groups of people. So this is particularly difficult if you have like photographs where you might not have any additional information about that particular group of people and their background, and you can't make assumptions. Yeah, it is difficult to say that. Sometimes you do have to use the sort of broader language, what we do know, when the more specific kind of details aren't available. But often as well, you can find additional information about particular sources by just kind of looking up related sources, looking up the author and information that we do have. It's very time consuming when using the glossary to kind of find alternative vocabulary, because you end up trying to find out the background of every single source and find out as much information as possible that you can add in. So yeah, a difficult task, but sometimes there's more information that is available than you think there might be.
Flowcharts, will they be available on the website once it's launched?
So this isn't available at the moment. It's very specific to the Glasgow School of Art Library based on the number of staff they had and the kinds of staff they had. It really sort of feeds into this mechanism of how they work, exactly which department would do different things. But I am thinking about creating some kind of more generic guidance from that work. I created this whole guidance pack with different kind of workshop activities for them, all related to advisory notices, the things they need to think about, the different kind of resources that they can use. But it was very specific to being a university library as well. They wanted to work very closely with the students. Yeah, I can speak to them about whether they'd want to share the existing version, but I'm not sure how useful that would be given its specificity.
Super, thank you very much. So the question about sort of senior management engagement, do you have any suggestions for how to frame EDI work in a way that highlights the urgency and danger of inaction when there are competing priorities?
Yeah, so as I try to emphasize with my rationale, there's, you know, the more sort of social activist kind of rationale that I personally identify with more, that people are being misrepresented, but also on the practical side, it's misinformation. It's not accurate to tell these histories of people by mislabeling them, by sort of homogenizing them. It makes it very difficult for users to find materials that they're looking for. If you take something like Orientalist, which was very, very widely used in the National Library of Scotland's catalogue, it conflates the entirety of the Middle East, East Asia, and South Asia. So if you're a user looking for materials on one specific region, then you have to filter through hundreds of search results to find that and kind of clarify which region it is talking about. So perhaps emphasizing that practical element alongside it, that it is the sector's responsibility to accurately curate the historical record, would sort of enhance that agenda.
Carry on submitting any questions that you might have. One very sort of specific one for the work that you have undertaken is, if a museum wanted to create their own glossaries based upon it or adapted it from yours, is there a copyright issue into account, and how would you like at least to be acknowledged?
So I think a lot of institutions are doing this and making their own version of the glossary, which I don't have an issue with. I'm not bothered about the copyright issue. However, it is frustrating that people are using this glossary and not feeding back into it. So you might be using it and you might find mistakes. You might find different terms come up, different kinds of spellings. And to be honest, I've had very little contribution on the Google Drive. This is pretty much a one-woman show, which is frustrating for me. I do like to, I would like if people using the glossary were able to kind of feed back into it in a way. And also it is a live document. I do actually add very small minor details pretty much every week as I'm doing my PhD readings on a whole range of topics. I was doing something on Korean nationalism today, learning things that I'd never looked at before and finding out terminology that I wasn't aware of before. So it is constantly being updated. There are a lot of mistakes. I notice mistakes every time I read it. So I do think that it does detract a bit from my motive of creating something that is alive and constantly being expanded and being improved in terms of its quality. So I would just kind of keep that in mind, that once you take it and make your own version, you're making something that is fixed. It might have errors and it might not reflect the most current information.
I think what's so valuable about it, and we have just had a question about a printed version of it, because not all institutions can access Google Drives. And I'm assuming that given the nature of its editability and revisions, it isn't possible yet to produce a printed copy.
Yeah, so and I'm hoping conversations develop with the National Library of Scotland and other partners. So it was the British Library, Collection Trust, and Matthew Digital. We're all interested in developing this project, but it hasn't come about. And I do hope that it would have funding at some point, and if we can have a series of editors and these sections can be reviewed by either people with academic expertise in these areas and people from the communities themselves, we could reach a point where we have something pretty solid that can either be available as a database or even a kind of printed copy. But I just don't think it's at that stage yet. It needs a lot of work. There's a lot of good information there, but it's just got such a long way to go. It's such a vast project to deal with all of these issues of inequality and different identities.
Into this, and it is greatly appreciated. If there's no other questions, we will let Carissa go. It is after midnight for her now. No, sorry, just as I say that, another question appears. A collection I'm working with at the moment has examples of offensive terminals, including in a place name, for example, Rio Negro, a tributary of the Amazon River. Would you have any advice on how to tackle this and acknowledge the issue?
Yeah, so I did add a place name section. I haven't got that specific example in there because it's incredibly broad. There's so many different versions of place names and things. In general, if something is the original language, I think it's best to add the contemporary recognized place name in square brackets or something. But also in general, when thinking about supplementing language, my best guidance is to not think about just swapping like a single term for another single term, but taking that space, just a sentence or two, to acknowledge the difficulty of determining the language and some of its complexities. We can acknowledge when we aren't completely certain about things and explain our rationale for picking one term over the other. So I think you could, if there's space and it's possible, just add a very small contextual note so that users are aware of that.
Super, thank you very much. We'll all await the website with great interest and excitement, and when it is launched, we will sort of share it as well on the SCA channel.
Yes, please support it, please contribute to the forums, be active. That will really help me out.
So yes, thank you again very much, Carissa, and have a good night.
Great, thank you so much.